me, this is what this moment comes down to. Are we going to pass a big enough package to vaccinate people, to get people back to work, to alleviate the suffering in this country this year? That's what I want to do. Or are we going to say the millions of Americans are out of work, many of whom have been out of work for 6 months or longer, who've been scarred by this economic and public health crisis? Don't worry, hang on, things are going to get better. We're going to go smaller, so it's just going to take us a lot longer. Like until 2025. That's the Republican answer right now. I can't in good conscience do that.
The curfew has gone into effect in Cuba's capital, Havana. It's aimed at curbing rising cases of COVID-19. From 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., only authorized vehicles and personnel are allowed out. Now, the new measure comes as the Caribbean island struggles with its worst surge since the beginning of the pandemic. Cases have shot up quickly since the country began reopening in November. And Cuba is the first country in Latin America to be developing its own vaccine. Ed Augustin reports.
I've been a correspondent in Cuba for 8 years now, and it never ceases to amaze me how the country that can't get its act together in terms of supplying basic goods, at the moment there's bread shortages, has this contradiction where it's got such a powerful biotech sector. It's the only country, as you say, in Latin America to have developed coronaviruses, and they have not one, not two, not three, but 4 in the works. It's the only country that is clinically testing its own vaccine, and it's possibly the only country in the world to have developed coronavirus vaccines without the involvement of big pharma. This is a completely publicly developed vaccine. This is a communist-ruled socialist state, and so 100% of the money for R&D, research and development, comes from the state. In terms of rollout, the phase 3 trials start in March for Sovereign DOS, so their most advanced vaccine. And the Cubans are saying, and scientists I spoke to are pretty confident, that they're going to be able to get everyone vaccinated this year, which means that it will be if they hit their target, one of the first countries to get that whole population vaccinated, people who will be vaccinated free of cost. And amongst other things that have been announced in the last few days, they've confirmed that tourists, which the country desperately needs to bring in hard currency, will be able to come here and choose amongst vaccines which jab they want to take, how they want to get vaccinated. So you've got the possibility here of tourism coming back in the last half of this year, and not only tourism, but health tourism.
A 2-day virtual summit of the African Union begins, and the event is being dominated by the pandemic. Leaders will discuss how to respond to the crisis. Many African countries are battling second waves and are having difficulty procuring sufficient vaccine doses for their populations.
At this hospital in Tunisia, doctors are forced to choose who gets to live, as the number of critical coronavirus patients outstrips the number of ICU beds.
Au début, c'est pas quelque chose qui a été accueilli à bras ouverts. Certains collègues, quelquefois, ne comprennent pas. C'est vrai que tout le monde a droit à la vie, mais cette place de réanimation, c'est très très précieux.
It comes as the continent as a whole struggles to deal with the virus after initially keeping infection numbers down. This in a region where many healthcare systems were already struggling. The fastest way to save lives is to vaccinate. But vaccine demand far outpaces production, and the World Health Organization has accused rich countries of hoarding the jab.
Globally, the number of vaccinations has now overtaken the number of reported infections. But more than 3/4 of those vaccinations are in just 10 countries that account for almost 60% of global.
Vax, the WHO program that gives developing countries the vaccine, has yet to deliver a single dose of the nearly 90 million promised to Africa. And neither has the African Union's ABAT program, which will provide 670 million doses. Some countries have decided they can't wait any longer. On Monday, South Africa got its first 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca jab.
The arrival of these vaccines contains the promise that we can turn the tide of this disease.
Morocco kicked off its mass vaccination program at the end of January with the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine, starting with the king, followed by healthcare workers, while Egypt and Guinea have also started their own programs. The continent needs 1.5 billion doses, according to the Africa Centre for Disease Control, but experts warn that at the current rate, immunization
Russia expelled diplomats from 3 European countries for allegedly taking part in protests in support of jailed critic Alexei Navalny. The move came after the European Union said ties with Moscow had hit a new low. The West has fiercely condemned Navalny's arrest last month, a subsequent crackdown of his supporters. Andrew Hillier has more.
It's a sign of just how low relations between the EU and Russia have sunk in recent weeks. Russia's decision to expel diplomats from Germany, Sweden and Poland is the latest escalation in the growing row over the jailing of Alexei Navalny. Moscow accuses the diplomats of attending weekend rallies in support of the opposition figure, which led to thousands of arrests. The move triggered condemnation across the EU.
Wir halten diese Ausweisung für ungerechtfertigt und glauben, dass das eine weitere Facette in dem ist, was ziemlich fernab von Rechtsstaatlichkeit im Augenblick gerade in Russland zu beobachten ist.
French President Emmanuel Macron, who was holding a virtual news conference with Merkel, also slammed the expulsion.
On ne gère pas les tensions politiques, quand bien même elles sont internes, de cette manière. Et je suis solidaire avec les 3 pays qui ont eu des diplomates expulsés.
The announcement came barely hours after the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, met his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Moscow, who didn't hide his contempt for the bloc.
Свою жизнь выстраиваем, исходя из того, что Евросоюз является ненадежным партнером, по крайней мере.
Borrell said Navalny's detention on his return to Russia heralded a low point in relations between both sides. The bloc is now under pressure to act, but so far, the EU has no formal plans to apply sanctions.
Museums are closed in Paris due to the pandemic, but galleries are allowed to remain open and have become a haven for art fans. And Sensation is an exhibition at the Le Long Gallery in Paris. British artist David Hockney, who now lives in Normandy, is showing his latest work. Our reporters Axel Simon and James Andre went to have a look.
He is the world's most expensive living artist. David Hockney has found a new muse, Normandy. He settled in the region 2 years ago. That was before the coronavirus pandemic broke out.
Il est très heureux. Il a vécu le confinement comme une aubaine. Il n'a pas de visiteurs, pas de touristes, pas de quai-vendeurs, il ne voit personne. Il a peint pendant des années la Californie, il en a un peu fait le tour, il avait assez de ce ciel qui est toujours bleu. Ensuite, il est revenu en Angleterre, dans le Yorkshire, il est resté une dizaine d'années, il a peint des paysages anglais, et il a trouvé ici en Normandie une autre lumière.
Museums in Paris are closed, and art buffs flock to the Le Long Gallery to discover the Hockney exhibition.
Ah, c'est tout à fait essentiel, autant que mon commerce à moi qui suis bouquiniste sur les quais de Seine. Parce que sans nous, sans la culture, disons, je crois qu'il n'y a plus de vie.
Most of the new drawings and paintings depict the artist's own garden in vivid color through the seasons.
Je sais qu'il travaille beaucoup sur iPad dernièrement. Mais là, je me rends compte que ce sont des tableaux de la vraie peinture, c'est plus cool. Et j'aime beaucoup les couleurs, j'aime beaucoup la vision de la nature.
C'est joyeux, ça fait bien, c'est le printemps. Donc on vient voir des œuvres, mais c'est aussi pour se faire du bien au moral.
This is a rare opportunity for Hockney enthusiasts to discover these works together. These paintings were all sold before the exhibition even opened to the public.
Well, that's the news for now. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.
Time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Villeneuve. Good to see you. This week we're going to focus on a controversial bill that's set to be debated in Parliament. It's aimed at combating extremist ideology and reinforces the founding principles of the French Republic, particularly France's special brand of state secularism known as laïcité. Analysts say it could be one of the most important pieces of legislation
legislation of Emmanuel Macron's presidency.
That's right. The French government says this draft legislation is nothing less than necessary for peaceful coexistence in France. It touches on some of the most sensitive issues of contemporary France and has already provoked a lot of reactions and misinterpretations abroad. So it's important to take the time to look at it in detail, starting with the title that you can see right here. You can see it's a bit of a mouthful. It's called the Projet de loi confortant le respect des principes de la République. So the bill is aimed at reinforcing or strengthening the respect of the principles of the French Republic. But what's interesting more than what's in the title is what's not in the title, because originally it was actually labeled a law against religious separatism and in particular radical Islam. But you won't find the words separatism or radical Islam or any other religion in this text, even though that's precisely what it's about.
Now, if you read between the lines, Flo, it's clear that this draft legislation is aimed at combating extremist ideology that has taken many, many lives here in France.
Absolutely. It comes in a particular context because France is a vibrant, multicultural country. It's home to the largest Muslim and Jewish populations in Europe, but France is also clearly in a crisis. More than 260 people have been killed in Islamist terrorist attacks since 2012. And shortly after the bill was announced came the jihadist-inspired beheading of a teacher, Samuel Paty, as well as the deadly knife attack in a church in Nice. Now, the government says there is an urgent need to fight what it says is a growing separatism in France that spreads terrorist ideology and violates the egalitarian principles of the French Republic.
I mean, that's where this draft law comes in, because it's aimed at, reducing the space that radicals have to deviate from French ideology and thinking and values. There's some 50 articles in this bill. Can you talk us through some of them?
Well, it covers a lot of ground. We won't have time to get into all of it, but let's just take a look at some of the key measures. For instance, the legislation will curb online hate speech of the kind that led to Monsieur Paty's death. It will also ban all public sector employees, so including private contractors, from wearing religious clothing in the workplace. For instance, people who work for the National Railway Company, the SNCF. There are also articles aimed at clamping down on polygamy, which is illegal in France, as well as forced marriages and doctors who provide so-called virginity certificates before traditional marriages. Now, a lot of the law is also aimed at regulating religious and other community associations which receive public subsidies. They will have to sign a declaration of allegiance to the values of the Republic, and there will be strict controlling of their funding. For instance, mosques will have to declare foreign funding of more than 10,000 euros.
Now, the government here in France insists that this bill is not singling out Muslims, but many perceive it that way.
Absolutely. Critics say that this bill is part of a culture of racism and Islamophobia in France. It's been condemned by countries like Turkey, as well as other Muslim countries. The government, meanwhile, insists that this bill will only target Islamist extremists, not Islam in general, but it's having a hard time controlling them.
Ce à quoi nous devons nous attaquer, c'est le séparatisme islamiste.
Quand on évoque le séparatisme, il n'y a pas que l'islamisme radical. Il y a d'autres choses. Et l'idée, c'est sans doute de ne pas être trop restrictif, même si ce texte vise essentiellement, bien sûr, l'islamisme radical.
Et pourquoi ce projet de loi n'est pas un texte contre les religions, ni contre la religion musulmane en particulier?
Macron and his ministers have been accused of pandering to the right ahead of the 2022 presidential election, but what's interesting is that critics on the right say that this bill doesn't go far enough.
Comme d'habitude, la montagne va accoucher d'une souris et les propositions semblent être évidemment, encore une fois, des gouttes d'eau face à l'océan des difficultés qui sont devant nous sur ces sujets-là.
Now, Flo, the French President Emmanuel Macron argues that these new laws are needed to reinforce France's secular system, but we already have laws in place for that.
Absolutely, and we've already spoken about it before, but it's worth remembering that France's brand of secularism, laïcité, which is our word du jour, is very particular. It's actually central to how France defines itself. There's a law from 1905 which guarantees the separation of church and state. It guarantees a freedom of conscience and the neutrality of the state when it comes to religion. It really is the cornerstone of the French Republic to many people. But critics say that instead of defending personal and religious freedom, laïcité actually attacks them, and in particular Islam. Now what's interesting is to look at opinion polls. A majority of French people believe that French secularism is actually under attack, and an overwhelming majority of people actually support the government in its efforts to clamp down on separatism. But, and this is very important, there are also calls for socio-economic measures to fight discrimination, particularly in the job market, in the housing market. And Macron himself has said that France suffers from its own form of separatism in neglecting the marginalization of some Muslims. And he's about to hold a national consultation on discrimination, because it's very important that it is also urgent to address this other side of this very thorny issue.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's all we have time for in this edition of French Connections. In the meantime, you can tweet your questions to Flo, and the address is @FloVilmino, and check out our website, france24.com.
Crisis hit Olympique de Marseille are getting ready to welcome Paris Saint-Germain on Sunday. Le Classique is one of French football's most anticipated clashes. Marseille are still reeling after last week's fan-led carnage at their training center that ended with 25 arrests, injured police officers, and burnt cars. If anything can lift the mood, it would be a win against their bitter rivals. You know, today we just have one desire, to